Welcome to the church library. Draw up a chair and join us as we sort through these stacks of old books. I'm Marissa Burt.
And I'm Kelsey McGinnis. And here in the church library, we host conversations about popular Christian books. This season, we are dusting off Christian parenting resources.
Our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families, examines many of these books, the obscure, the bestsellers, the ones that still pop up in church parenting classes.
Let's see what's on the bookshelves today.
Hi, it's Marissa here today in the church library with a special bonus episode for you. As you know, we wrapped up season 1 a few weeks ago, and it'll be a while before we get into season 2. But we have this long-awaited conversation around ideas about sin and atonement and how these show up in Christian parenting resources. And a few weeks ago, I had a fascinating conversation with theologian Andrew Remington Rillera, the author of the book Lamb of the Free, Recovering the Varied Sacrificial Understandings of Jesus' Death. And so today's bonus episode is going to include different selections from that conversation. And I wanted to start with a little bit about Andrew and his book. So Andrew is assistant professor of biblical studies and theology at the King's University in Edmonton, Alberta in Canada. And he'll speak a little bit more to his biography later on in the episode. But I wanted to start with reading you the back copy from his book. It's linked in the show notes because I think this will give you a good idea of some of the things we discuss in today's episode. Lamb of the Free analyzes the different sacrificial imagery applied to Jesus in the New Testament in light of the facts that A, there is no such thing as substitutionary death sacrifice in the Torah. Neither death nor suffering nor punishment of the animal has any place in the sacrificial system. And B, there are both atoning and non-atoning sacrifices. Surprisingly, the earliest and most common sacrifices associated with Jesus' death are the non-atoning ones. Nevertheless, when considering the whole New Testament, Jesus is said to accomplish all the benefits of the entire Levitical system, from both atoning and non-atoning sacrifices and purification. Moreover, all sacrificial interpretations of Jesus' death in the New Testament operate within the paradigm of participation, which is antithetical to notions of substitution. The sacrificial imagery in the New Testament is aimed at grounding the exhortation for the audience to be conformed to the cruciform image of Jesus by sharing in his death. The consistent message throughout the entire New Testament is not that Jesus died instead of us. Rather, Jesus dies ahead of us so that we can unite with him and be conformed to the image of his death. And so you can learn a little bit more about his book if you click through on the link. We cover a lot of ground in this conversation. It's part Bible study, part commentary, part discussion of how this blew up on social media a few weeks ago. And you'll hear me popping in to provide some context between excerpts. But I hope you'll enjoy this episode and this conversation. I often hear from you that this is something you're thinking through, particularly if you're revisiting messages you received in childhood or thinking about how you want to communicate theological ideas to your children if you're currently a parent. So we'll jump right into the first part of our conversation where Andrew provides a brief personal bio. Welcome back to the church library. I am thrilled today to have a guest with us. Andrew, I am so glad to have you with us. Could you take a minute and introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
Hi, I'm honored to be invited and to get to share my work with a different sort of audience and see how these things are interrelated, these topics interrelated and inherently practical, as it were, like not just historical or some kind of linguistic reconstruction or something just for the sake of academic analysis, but how incredibly intertwined all this stuff is, and it's complex, and there's no easy untangling of things. But so my name is Andrew Rillera. I grew up Jehovah's Witness. Then late elementary, junior high, I was baptized in church mainly drawing its pastors from the Master's Seminary. That means people so I was in Southern California, like 20 minutes ish, depending on traffic, 20, 30 minutes away from the campus there.
And that's
so a lot of
John MacArthur's seminary,
John MacArthur's,
right?
Yeah, he was president or chancellor. I don't forget his title, but Grace Community Church is linked with the Master's College and Seminary. And so in just kind of like in that world, once I became left Jehovah's Witnesses for doctrinal reasons, mainly surrounding the divinity of Jesus and the Spirit, like Trinity and some of Jehovah's Witness distinctives. Now I'm worshiping at an Anglican church, and I say that like we're Anglican, but like Anglican because it's very capacious, like a capacity for differences and good dialogue, like not just disagreement, but dialogue and conversations. And I was heavily influenced by Rowan Williams and N.T. Wright when I was doing my undergrad work in biblical studies and master's level. And so I didn't really want to church hop. And as things kind of happened in my life that I won't get into, I've shared on other podcasts if people are interested, a little bit more biography there. I teach biblical studies and theology in Canada, in Edmonton, Alberta. And I've been there for 4 years, starting my 5th year, school year, just next week. And yeah, so I'm not Canadian. Some people thought when they've looked me up that I'm Canadian, but I am not. U.S. citizen, born and raised Southern California, and then did my PhD in North Carolina, and so lived there for 5 years, and then now in Edmonton, Alberta.
So Andrew and I started talking about current events on social media, and we'll get to that later in the podcast, but I thought it would make more sense for you as listeners if we started with the segment where he defines penal substitutionary atonement for us and how he addresses it in his book. So that's where we're going to pick up next. Okay, so let's talk about penal substitutionary atonement. For a number of people, it is the primary vocabulary through which they're introduced to the gospel. So I wondered if, most of our listeners, I hear from people all the time who, in the very rudimentary way we touch on this, when we're talking about the way penal substitutionary shows up in Christian parenting resources as kind of like a stowaway doctrine. It kind of shows up in these subtle ways. And when we talk about that, I'll hear from people who say it's the very first time they are hearing that there is maybe another perspective on the atonement, or that there are multiple atonement theories, or any of this. That is a new information for them. So let's talk about penal substitutionary atonement, because it does show up all the time as a default for many people. Could you give maybe a definition of what you see as the common way it shows up for people, not people with an academic background, but maybe the people who are tweeting about it? Like, what do you think they perceive it as? And then what, in your sense, is how would you define it when you're setting out to talk about it in your book? Or is there a distinction there?
So, yeah, like this is one of the things a lot of the response to Comer's post about my book was generating is people saying, well, it's not these bad versions. It's not the divine child abuse version. It's not these kinds of versions. Like, here's a more palatable version of penal substitutionary atonement. And they're quick to do those sorts of things. In the pews, what a lot of people hear is some sort of divine child abuse, right? And I've seen some of your posts, like some of these books that come out, like he took our licking or whatever, the spanking, the whipping, and it's
people
portrayed
are
like that.
Told that,
yeah. And so it's like, if these more palatable versions, like, why aren't they? If it's been so long, how come it hasn't trickled down, as it were, into the pews? So that's, I don't know. That's just an observation that why is there such a divide? Why is it only, why are the more palatable versions not the most common that we're hearing? Like, in lived
Is that
experience
what
within
is that
Christian
like a
churches, within
pastoral
parishes,
failure or
within,
what? Yeah.
no, I don't know like that.
Yeah.
But there is a distinction, I think, largely mapped on, like, and obviously there's nuance. So not everyone is going to, some people are going to be like, well, I was in church and it was my pastor who told me
Right.
about the, of course, and good.
Yeah.
Yay for you, I guess.
Yeah,
But at
yeah.
the same time, well, that's why I don't take those angles about
Mm,
what I'm uh, arguing against, is because I'm saying in any form, it's mistaken in each one of its terms. Uh, how it construes penalty, God's wrath, punishment, um, what it notions of substitution and atonement, and how it
mhm.
links in and misunderstands sacrifice. And the sacrifice is the multiplicity of the ones in Leviticus and throughout, the Levitical sacrificial system. Obviously, there's, discusses it in a number of Deuteronomy, but I just mean, yeah. Anyways, that the Torah's framework. And I think they're mistaken in each one of it's mistaken in each one of its terms when you do the historical exegetical, so close reading of the text, and then the New Testament's use of the Old Testament and the prophetic promises and things like that. So I undermine it from a different way. It's not, I don't say like, well, that's too mean or something, and you can and ought to, and there are people who make those arguments. That's just not what I'm doing. But so to define it, we'll define it in from the horse's mouth, as it were, right? The people who are
Yes, that'd be great.
presenting the so-called more like palatable version, which they think is more true to the exegesis and whatever and stuff. But again, well, the natural, we have to have the discussion of the exegetical,
Mhm.
historical context level, which is why that's what I do. I don't, uh, do these
Tis the
other
book for those of you who haven't read
yeah,
it,
that's
which
the
is
book. That's
the book.
it.
Yes, it's
But so in
amazing.
the book, I define it from John Stackhouse's claim: God cannot just forgive our sins without anyone suffering. So that's a key premise in penal substitution. So that's suffering, that's punishment, right? And that there's this condition to God's forgiveness. So that's a premise that then they work out into, hey, then how does this forgiveness happens? Well, the someone who suffers in your stead is Jesus. And so he goes on to say, the elaborate sacrificial system of the Torah was ordained by God to symbolize this fundamental reality. So in his mind, it's precisely the sacrificial system of Torah that teaches us God cannot forgive sins without anyone suffering. And that provides then what he then says, quote, is the logic of justice. So he's putting the concept of justice into the whole framework of the sacrificial system of the Torah, which is the law of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and saying this is God's justice, cannot just forgive sins without anyone suffering. In the Levitical system, it's these animals that are suffering, and that therefore Jesus was that suffering sacrifice, taking on that penalty, substitutionary in our place instead of us. He dies so that we don't have to. And what I go through in the beginning, which is the Old Testament sections, is that sacrifice doesn't have much to do with justice per se. Like that's not its conceptual framework at all. And people who are deriving their view of what justice is on a mistaken view of Levitical sacrifice, well, like that's going to impact a lot of stuff.
Well, can you
So
say that again? I would just want to underline that.
Yeah, people form a notion of God's justice and about cannot forgive sins without anyone suffering. That sort of logic of justice, as he says, and that the sacrificial system teaches us that. But it doesn't. That's what like you've framed your whole notion of justice and what God's justice is. It's anchored in a complete misunderstanding. And I do mean complete. I say that like I do mean complete because they're not doing the careful work to even understand the nuances themselves within the different sacrifices and within how purity works relative to the body, which is different than a sacred space, which is different than the land, and how all these things coordinate together. It's just very sloppy and hasty connections to then bring someone to the point of this is God's justice. It's retributive. They're punishing this animal in your place. You're presenting God with your life is forfeit, deserves to die. So then you instead kill this other thing. So that, and it's like, that's not even just absent. The whole thing, when you understand it, probably and investigate it, it precludes that. Like, there's just whatever it means. Again, some of these bits are like, if I'm wrong in what it means positively, there's just too many angles that undermine this notion that this has to do with justice and a substitutionary death and this animal suffering, and you're said even to the point of death. Not there at all. And a lot of what they're doing is separate. They being the sacrificial system, like what we see in Leviticus, these protocols, is untethering the notion of sacrifice from death. It's presenting death is what needs to be decontaminated. Our sins generate like a death contamination, and it clings to sacred space, and that needs to be purged,
like removed,
cleansed, removed with life. And it's not. Well, now I'm getting ahead of myself, but anyways, like the point is a cleansing agent, and it's cleansing the sanctuary because that's where God dwells, and God needs to have a clean space to be. Like that, if the impurities get too much, too overwhelming, then the divine presence is going to leave, right? And that's a vulnerable spot. No protection, there's no communion there. So the sacrifices are purging God's space so that presence can be maintained. But what is happening is you are decontaminating the space, the sacred space, purging it with a life detergent. So it's a ritual detergent, and they are again, read the book for the details. But they're and this isn't stuff that it's new to me. All notions of suffering are removed, and death actually are removed. That if so much so that a sacrifice is a transformative event, ritually speaking, to where it makes the killing of the animal a sacrifice, I think, rather than a killing. But it does say if you do this apart from worship and use it going through these protocols, then it counts as murder, counts as shedding blood. They realize the biological fact is animals dying, but they do not want to associate impurity as the forces of death. And so you don't how are we bringing death into God? Like, how does that work? And they reconceptualize the whole thing, say, no, this is transforming it to you're not presenting God with a death. You're presenting God with life. Because and again, from an outsider's perspective, you may say like, okay, like wishful thinking, whatever. And that's okay. My job is just to, what do they say? What do they think they're doing here?
How did
what they think they are doing, they explicitly say and raise the stakes. If you don't do it this way, this counts as shedding blood. The only way it does not count as killing, it's not still a killing, just you give it over to it's no. Now, when you do it in this way, it's not a killing anymore. It becomes a sacrifice. If you don't follow these protocols, you don't do it at the tabernacle, then it's bloodshed. So bloodshed only comes in precisely when you're not doing the sacrifice, which means sacrifice isn't bringing death into, because it makes it no longer spilling blood. You're no longer shedding blood. So blood guilt. The other thing is when you do, not all sins are equal. And when the sin puts the life of the offender, like they have a forfeit life, then cut off or given over to the death penalty, which is technically two different things in the Torah, but like your life is forfeit. There's no sacrifice. You cannot do it. So if the one time when you're like, sure, would be great if I can have a life for life exchange option here, that is precisely when there is no sacrifice available for that. So that all, like, again, like there's more reasons, but those are two, I think, pretty good ones. It's whatever's going on. Like, so that then you go, well, if it's not that, what is it? Because I've been okay, well then read the book. But also, even if I'm wrong on that side of things of like what is happening, I think this is upholding. In fact, a book just recently came out by Paul Sloan called Jesus and the Law of Moses, I believe.
I saw that coming through, and
that has a lot of engagement with my work in there. And it's it either anchors a lot of his points I want to do, or like gives even more supporting reasons for some of these things, like so that key moments. And so like there's one little bit of disagreement that if you go on my Twitter, you can see it in a footnote, but it's the kind of disagreement was like, oh, that's where all the fun happens. Like, and I'm happy to engage those things. But again, it doesn't undermine, like, even within his footnote there, he frames it with like what we agree on, and that it's like that's where it matters. This isn't penal. This isn't substitutionary. And he's talking about the notion of sacrifice, relating it to jubilee and debt satisfaction or debt release, and so it's an important thing. I care about it, but like our disagreement on those little minutia doesn't undermine the larger claims. And so what I'm trying to say is, when it comes to these things of sacrifice and stuff, there's so many now, a growing number of us scholars who are working on this in related but kind of like adjacent as well fields, and think we're just it's becoming mutually reinforcing and corroborating. We're building on each other and or providing other evidence from other areas and how it fits. It has explanatory power, and that's when you start to know you're onto something. Historically speaking, is when things just start clicking more, and it starts to. You start to be able to see how it impacts this or that other topic or that other question people have with, Jesus and the law of Moses or whatever. This isn't going to go away by some Gospel Coalition article or whatever, because what a lot of us are discovering goes at the root of all, so the premise with justice and sacrifice and these kinds of things. And there's just too much going on against that framework, to where I affirm Jesus has, the New Testament talks about the saving significance in Jesus's death in a variety of ways. But that doesn't mean penal substitutionary atonement is one of them. In fact, I think it's ruled out. It's not just like absent, it's like ruled out. That's like with the death thing with the sacrifice. It's not just that some of these notions are absent, it's that it's ruled out. It can't be a substitutionary death if that's the one kind, not the one, there's other things, but when your life is forfeit, there is no sacrificial remedy.
In opposition to what we do to them. Like, we've totally misunderstood, which is mind-blowing. And as I was reading your book, if I could have done that little head exploding emoji with my pen, I would have just all these exclamation points, because I think what you do so well, particularly those of us coming from an evangelical background who have a high regard for the historical critical method or for trying to dig into scripture, to say, absolutely, you're right. You're connecting these dots, that it's not there. Like this, it's not there. And I still feel a little jaw on the floor about that. Probably because I'm not in academic circles where some of this conversation maybe has been happening in different ways over the years. But like, for real, this one erroneous premise that has really had so many downstream effects in Christian life and practice. And so I want so many people to pick up your book, because I think they will find it to be such a satisfying exploration of that. It really goes deep. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to what you think, for the average layperson in a parish, what would be helpful for them to understand about the different kinds of sacrifices in the Levitical system and how that is relevant. Because I think for many, there's just this general category of like, substitution took our place, and can turn into a kind of Christian word salad pretty quickly that people are just kind of regurgitating because, as I saw someone on Twitter say, this is the heartbeat of the gospel. Like they're told that.
So a couple, well, I want to respond to that last, the heartbeat of the gospel comment. Here's some homework for anyone that's like, I've been taught that or whatever. Go read Acts. All the speeches in Acts, gospel presentation speeches, and just outline what's said and what's not said. Notice the place of Jesus' death in those speeches. What function does it have? Where's the saving significance being placed? Is it Jesus' resurrection or his death? How is his death being construed? What kind of a so-called, I don't even want to, I disrupt this notion of atonement early in the book. Atonement is too ambiguous of a word. Because it means like reconciliate. It can mean all kinds of things, but there's no sacrificial. We'll put that. There's no sacrificial atonement in these speeches. And so, are we going to say that the apostles failed to preach the gospel?
Yeah, that they missed it somehow.
So that was actually the one that got me going in undergrad on some of this stuff.
It's a really good point.
We had to do observation projects, And I wanted to compare the differences between Jewish audiences and Gentile audiences. And then I was like, well, hold on a second, though. That's
We're not
cool, but
talking about
also
any
like
of this.
so much stuff is missing that I've apparently been told. And so I have I explain a lot of this, especially when I get into Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, because that does have an sacrificial atonement predicated to Jesus, and so does First John. But now that we did all that ground clearing and all that, then we can understand what's going on. But one of the things Hebrews is forthright about is that this is mature theology. This isn't the basic proclamations of the gospel. It tells us this right in Hebrews 5 and 6.
You're right. You're right.
So but then even its atonement theology isn't penal substitutionary atonement either. He does have the author does have an atonement theology, but yeah. So read it's a fun exploration there, but so yeah, it's literally not the heartbeat of the gospel. You can also do another way. Look up euangelion or the noun for good news and the verb euangelizo. So to proclaim the good news and just what
is the good news?
The proclamation there? Yeah. And again, there's going to be ones like died for. Well, yeah, I deal with that but death isn't automatically sacrifice either. And crucially, we have to understand what is that beneficiary for? Like Jesus died for. Like, how is it to our benefit? How does the author tell us it's to our benefit? And I unpack that, and the conclusion is or one of the conclusions is it's always for us to the extent that we are joined in and participate and share in it. The benefit is precisely within a participatory union register, not substitution. I think a lot of people hold on to substitution because for whatever reason, and maybe they're not even explicit about this, but I think what they're holding on to is the saving uniqueness of Jesus' death. And so what I say a few times in there, Jesus' death is soteriologically unique. His life, death, and resurrection. But substitution is inadequate. Not just inadequate, though. I want to say more than that. It is inadequate. And it's also just wrong, a mistaken way to construe that uniqueness. There are other ways that we can talk about the things that are unique that are non-substitutionary. And it's not just that the mere possibility of non-substitutionary uniqueness exists and therefore let's latch onto that. It's no, let's investigate the so-called substitutionary passages, and we see that they're not substitutionary. They're not instead of.
Emphasis.
They're not in place of. It's always place sharing. It's always with. It's always koinonia and fellowship. It's participation, solidarity, union. It's all those things that preclude these notions of instead of. So a way I summarize it is it's not that Jesus died instead of us. He dies ahead of us. And this is, Hebrews even talks about him as a pioneer. But we follow after him precisely in this. There aren't two crosses. There's not a cross that deals with some made up notion of spiritual death. That's the other thing. Theology has invented new phrases
to make it make sense, to try and make it make sense.
There are two crosses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nope. It's the one that we bear with Christ. We're co-crucified with him. We share in the likeness of his death. Buried with him. It's all over the place. Walk as he walked. And we're not told to be carpenters. We're not told to be itinerant. We're not told to be single. Paul just has a little shout out. It's actually easier if you are, but he doesn't say you have to be, right? Anything else about Jesus' life, we're not called to imitate except the pattern and character of his cruciform, cross-shaped life. The only cross the New Testament knows is a cross that of Christ that we share and bear and get up on with. Right? It's the only way. The Bible does talk about more than just biological death, but it's covenant death. It's Frank Moses give you life and death in Deuteronomy 30:15-20, right? It's the covenant curses. So there's a covenant nuance to what death means, and it's our systems. People talk about having issues. Remember a couple of years ago, it was all systemic injustice is the big doesn't matter. It's individual heart. It's no, the Bible talks about systemic injustice all over the place. That's actually what it calls death and curse. If you read Deuteronomy 28-30, read the end of Leviticus where it maps out these curses. Jeremiah and the prophets, the other prophets as they're mapping these out. The death that we are living under is a covenant death. So it's not just biological, but it's the way our societies interact with each other, both internally and then with other communities and nations and peoples. And the death is at that level, socio-political death. So I also have an article in Ephesians 2 on this. It's just upload on my
okay, I might
academia
throw
page
that
or
in the
whatever.
show notes too. Yeah, okay.
So on that, so before we get to the sacrifice, I know we're getting there. So substitution, here's the clip. I argue against substitution on the basis of Simon Gathercole's definition of substitution in his book, Defending Substitution. And I love his definition of it because he separates it out conceptually, philosophically, logically from notions of representation and with, like place sharing, not substitution, he says. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. So then he says, but here, like, there is substitution and it's these passages. So I address those. I deal with that. But that definition of substitution, he set the terms of the debate. And like, I don't see any flaws in the way he's describing it. Someone will have to do that though, if they're trying to go after my notion of substitution, because I'm just saying, okay,
You're
this guy,
responding
like,
to this.
here it is, and let's see if we actually find that, like, on his own terms. We don't see substitution in the New Testament. However, we see uniqueness in that. So I have, like, there are things that, like, surgeons, for example, do things for us that we can't do ourselves. But you don't talk about they're our substitute because that's like nonsense. That's not like it's not when you use the word unless a different surgeon's filling in, right? But you do something for me, or like, our mothers who birthed us. That was something for us we couldn't do, but they that you just don't use substitute to capture certain moments of unique beneficial help someone's receiving. And so Jesus taking away their infirmities in Matthew, where it quotes from Isaiah 53, that's not a substitution. He's not substituting anything. He's just healing them, like rescuing. Sometimes, and that's part of the uniqueness bit. So there is a uniqueness, and there's more. Just trying to give a teaser. Like, if you're worried about that, this is just like, okay, if it's not substitutionary, what is this? Moral exemplar? Like, no, it's way more real and thick than that, because we have a participation through Christ's Spirit in conformity to his character. We live it, we are joined to it, but that's not a substitution. But there's a lot of uniqueness going on. So I unpack that. I just want to be clear. If you get rid of substitution, doesn't mean you're left with a non-unique Jesus and it's just some example that you just like, okay, I guess we just got to work really hard to be like that or something. No, it's way more substantive and real than that.
Yeah. Also more satisfying in dealing with what you're talking about, the kind of collective impact, the societal systemic sin, or the collective need for help.
I mean, that's what Peter says. You've been redeemed. Right, so an Exodus metaphor from the corrupt ways of life. But it's a patterns of behavior that you learned from your ancestors. So those are the pharaohs. Like, it's our ways of life, our patterns of living. That's what we're redeemed from. We're not redeemed from God's going to torture you or some sort of like
God
the wrath.
Can't handle
like
it.
Again, read the covenant curse. What is death? It's living under these corrupt reigns and corrupt political societies that deform who we are in the image of God, because they push us into whatever. We can be anti-capitalist, but any feudal, like whatever sort of economy we happen to be living under, and what our military might of where we're at is given to sustain, it's going to be a form of covenant curse. That's what our death is. The Gentiles haven't all of a sudden nailed it, and then they're like inhabiting perfect covenant justice of life.
The way that will be good for everyone.
The death that we are redeemed from, or what we're redeemed from, is the cultural, socio-political, cultural inheritance of our ancestors. That is what we are redeemed. That is our Egypt. Those are the pharaohs of sin and death. It's not that he's saving us from some future, whatever control of God's wrath we have or whatever.
Yeah, in a transactional, it says it right there. First, kind of personal way. Yeah,
he's making you into a new sort of people. Anyways, okay, so the penal side of things. The other thing is there is a penal element. But not the way in penal substitutionary atonement works. It's Christ taking on in full solidarity that death, living in, as Paul says, the likeness of sinful flesh. I just want to be clear before we get into the sacrifice, because people with questions, go here and there.
Yeah.
Substitution does not require us to deny the saving uniqueness and what Jesus does. So read for more, but just I deal with that. There is a uniqueness. Substitution is just not the way to do that. The second thing is, we do have to contend with and talk about and situate this notion of God's wrath or penalty or covenant curse, those kinds of things. Because yes, that is there. So again, these are things I'm obviously aware of and I address, but I know that that's quickly like, well, what do you mean? So there's no there's no wrath or whatever. Oh, no, there is, but how it is dealt with in the New Testament is not the way penal substitutionary frameworks handle it. And even I think some of the more palatable ones, the way I would assess some of the ones that actually sound better is they fail on the substitutionary part. What they're actually articulating is what I call in the book covenant curse solidarity. Like it's coming into it's a solidarity, it's a sharing in. He's place sharing, not place taking. Jesus, he being Jesus. And so I'm like, well, I might like that version, but that's no longer PSA. That's no longer penal substitutionary atonement. Yeah. So, all right. So atonement, though. Now we're at the atonement part of PSA. And this is where, so yeah, like Stackhouse, Schreiner, they hook it into the Levitical system, and they're using atonement in a sacrificial sense, as well as it's more broader, like just reconciliation. I try to, or I stick with, when I say atonement in the book, I mean the sacrificial kind, the one, kippur from Hebrew. And then I later, once I get to that point, establish a decontamination as the like that's what atonement means and is. And so, like the day of decontamination instead of saying the day of atonement.
To help kind of bring clarity.
Yeah. What's happening?
Yeah, that's helpful.
So on this, so sacrifices now. Okay, some sacrifices have this atoning function. Well, what I would want people to know about the sacrificial system, we've already handled a couple of them. It's not about substitutionary death. It's not about suffering. Again, details spelled out there. We'll move on from that. The two main functions of sacrifice. A lot of people just don't even know that there's various functions.
Yeah.
Within these two functions, there's subdivisions, but there's two broad functions. One is to have a sacred, so a sanctifying meal. Not all meals are sacred. They have to go through a process of consecration, which means being touched by the altar. And so you have a sacred meal shared between the altar, so representing God, God's portion, the officiating priest, and then the offerer, usually more than one, because all that meat feeds a bunch of people, and you got to eat it depending on, there's three kinds of these. They're non-atoning, no atoning, no decontaminating function. And these sacred meals, there's three types of them outlined in Leviticus. And these are the only ones that are meals for the offerer. And they have various due dates. So you got to eat it all within 2 days or 1 day. And anything not, you burn and things. So that's I would say that's also the primary one. It's to have communion. So some of these sacrifices in your translations will be called fellowship offerings or communion offerings or peace offerings. But the peace offering can be misunderstood, like you think, like it's making peace, but it's celebrating your shalom, your peacefulness. You're celebrating your well-being. So
There's
I call them
feasting
well-being
kind
sacrifices.
of.
Yeah, it's your thing. They're in context of thanks and praise, and it's just having a sacred meal in God's presence. So it's this, and has nothing to do with sins, nothing to do with decontamination. All those verbs are absent. The other function then is the atoning ones, the decontaminating ones, and they decontaminate the sacred space. So sancta, plural, like not just one, like the outer altar, the different spaces in the tabernacle, and these ones cannot be eaten by the offerer because you're bringing it, something you've done, and it could be sinful or it could be not. It could just be gave birth. Could be you used to have the skin disease that made you look white for a bit. This white scaly stuff, it went away. And that actually produces a ritual contamination on the sanctuary, just like our sins do. And so you need to go bring the detergent to the priest to decontaminate sacred space. But now you don't eat the meat because you can't. It's not a feast. It's more associated with fasting. So you're not eating. And that's why the Day of Atonement, our day of decontamination, no eating. Because of the whole, it kind of just like turns that up to 11. Then it's known as the fast. But what's being decontaminated is not the person; it's the sacred space.
Space, okay.
It's the holy objects and spaces in the temple. So, what we learned from that whole, we learn a few things about this. So now we know there's two different kinds of sacrifice. So if you're already thinking about Jesus, you go, okay. When there's sacrificial imagery, which one is it of these two categories? And then of those two categories, they're going to subdivide so then you could, do some further drilling down. But, right away, Lord's Supper, not an atoning it can't be. You're eating it. There's no, it's
No atoning.
precluded.
It's fellowship, it's participation, all the things you're talking
and
about.
this is why, like Hebrews, which deals with atonement, doesn't bring up the Lord's Supper. It's perplexed a lot of people before. Like they're like, this, some historical scholars, do they even know of the Lord's Supper or whatever? No, it's because it's theologically irrelevant to the point he's making.
Yeah,
you cannot anchor. Let's think about Jesus in terms of a sacrifice that you're excluded from eating, and try to smash that into one where we're all eating. It's like you can't. You would never do that if you know what you're talking about. And so even the question of like why, like, oh, this is so odd. No, it's not so odd. And it makes perfect sense when you understand the Levitical system, why it would be absent from this presentation, thinking about Jesus with an atoning significance. The other thing we learned about this decontamination process and the various sins is that not all sins are equal. Not all sins contaminate equally. So some sins only purge the outer altar, thus the atoning sacrifices, specific blood rituals. So also between atoning and non-atoning, there's different, you put the blood, you do different things with the blood, put it in different places, depending on what its function is. The kippur ones have very specific, the blood goes here and whatever, things. I don't want to get into all those details because I'm very tempted, but I won't. But what we learn is the more intense the sin, the more the sin contamination penetrates into holy space. So first there's the outer altar, more serious, or if it's like a leader, then it goes into the Holy of Holies where there's the inner incense altar. And then the grievous ones, but hold on, it's not the rest, it's not all the rest, but the more intense ones, Holy of Holies. And then that is only purged Day of Decontamination, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. The other thing, so we already mentioned earlier, if your life is forfeit, you've done something like that, no atoning significance. And that's because that sin is said to pollute the person and the land. And since atoning sacrifices only purge the sancta, then sins that are more grievous, that do pollute the person and do pollute the land, well, now this is beyond the God-ordained capacity for the atoning sacrifices to decontaminate. So how does the land get cleansed? Exile. That it's like washing away, just on analogy to how bodies are cleansed with water and time. When the people are washed away in exile and the time says to relive their Sabbaths, that's what cleanses the land. People are going to be cleansed on analogy to ritual purification. So ritual purification has no moral status. It's not a sin to be ritually impure. A lot of people misunderstand the gospel stories about that, about Jesus touching. Like, it's not a sin. He's not overturning anything. People are going to be ritually impure all over the place. Often, you just got to be aware of your status to mitigate it so it doesn't exponentially grow. And the reason is because it gives you access to sacred space. So ritual purity is about access. It's like you're fit to enter sacred space for the time being. But you can be a murderer and ritually pure. They don't coordinate. But how bodies are purified is some combination of time and water. For certain things like scale disease, so that like often called leprosy, it's not this like limbs falling off thing. It's more like psoriasis, maybe not what we think of, something like that. Yeah, it's very mild, but it turns your skin white. You can look at my footnotes for how to, if that's something people are nerd out about or whatever. But when you can't just wash and be fine. Like so long as the condition is there, so long as you have an abnormal discharge or you had sexual intercourse the day before, like you can't get clean beyond until certain things have happened. Either those conditions have to have been passed, then you go through the washings and various, depending on the thing, it has different protocols. But you have to wait at least a day after, say, sexual intercourse. Again, not sin, but it makes you ritually impure. And because ritually impure has nothing to do with it, giving birth, all these sorts of things. But you have to wait for certain things have to happen, usually time or water. So what about these sins now that are beyond the capacity of the atoning sacrifices to heal, right? Because if atoning sacrifices only decontaminate sacred space, what about the ones that contaminate people in the land? Well, the land with exile, as we said. And now people, the prophets, all are hoping for this divine water washing. David, Psalm, and in his, it was Psalm 51, I believe, it's washing with hyssop Maybe it's
Mhm.
no it's like
They
named sacrifices
recognize,
are impotent
yeah.
here, right? And it's not because it's not saying sacrifices are bad. We got to move past it. It's like they are limited.
Mm,
And that was our like a lot of Christian mistake is to think that the Day of Atonement's the be all end all of forgiveness or something. It's not. It handles a very limited set of things, and this is what energizes the back half of Leviticus. So the Day of Atonement occurs in Leviticus 16, and then the back half of Leviticus is often what scholars call like the holiness code, like the moral impurity. But when the sins of these the sins that pollute land and people are murder, sexual immorality, and idolatry. Um, so there's no sacrificial remedy for those sins, precisely because their contamination is too much for the sacrificial system to handle, because it goes to the person, goes to the land. So the prophets say, well, God can handle it.
yeah.
But how they talk about it is in terms of on analogy to ritual purification with water washing and time. So the time of exile, the time of release, so Jubilee, it's time and water washing. So John the Baptist, right? Immersion, like washed by the Spirit.
Wow.
And yeah, so that like there's a basic rundown there. I think that's as brief as I might be able to put it for the sacrificial system.
Yeah,
And
that's
what I
really
do in the New
helpful.
Testament is the cleansing. Like notice how a lot of the cleansing language in the New Testament for people, or not just it's always washing. It's always water imagery, because it's not a sacrifice that's going to do it for you.
Calling
It's a
back to
washing.
this
And
washing.
so, yeah,
Yeah.
it's using Jesus' blood. So again, like these kind of like simplistic notions of sacrifice, it's not talking about him as a sacrifice, but it's using that liquid, viscous substance,
Mhm,
as a washing,
mhm.
and the Spirit, the living waters, like they kind of interchangeable there. So I have well in the prophetic section, my section on the prophets in chapter 4, and then get into it in chapter 6 with First John and Hebrews, with these washing elements. Okay, so then can't we still be atoned then if we're now sacred space? And if we're the people are the tabernacle, are the temple, we're also made priests, then doesn't that mean we can receive atonement sacrificially because we're sacred space? And Paul in 1 Corinthians 6:19 says our bodies are temples, right? So it's also in Ephesians 2 and stuff. But what's interesting is just earlier in 1 Corinthians 6, so 6:11, when he's talking about us as people, as bodies, embodied
Mhm.
creatures, he says that we're washed by the divine Spirit in
Mhm.
6:11, right? And this washing that is just like Ezekiel 36 promises, and then, as I said, the Levitical protocols for human purification. So even when he's using temple metaphors to talk about our reception of the Spirit and that being Christ's body, well, then he still is applying bodily protocols to us as
Mhm.
bodies, right? So washing stuff that happens. Similar stuff happens in Hebrews 9 and 10. I'll save that for the book, but it
Mhm.
has to do with the ash water for corpse impurity. It
Mhm.
talks about our dead conscience and dead work, saving us from death. So it's activating the corpse impurity protocol, but it's a water ritual that
So it's
happens.
remarkably
Um,
consistent across. It's
yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah.
again, it's just maybe we have gaps in our spiritual imagination how we come to this, so we're maybe trying to
hmm
force things, but this idea is the good news is that the day of washing has come. Yes?
The day of
That it
yeah,
came it this
and
is Jesus.
with this
It has
washing by the
come. The
Spirit,
washing
exactly.
finally
Yep,
came that all the
and it's
prophets were looking
union,
for.
right? Yep. So
Mm,
the baptism there isn't just washing for Paul; it's it's co-crucifixion, and not just as a ritual. And it's this permeates our life. It's that character. So then hooks in the First Peter, like saving us from these patterns of behavior because we are now living into the pattern of the cross-shaped God that we were, who became human, who had all these rights, privileges, authority, but instead I'm riffing on Philippians 2 now. But that Paul says, have that same mind, have that same attitude, that same mindset, this cross-shaped, humbling, serving, um, place sharing, show solidarity with those who are at risk and those who are under the thumb of these oppressors. Join in their vulnerability. Why? Because that's what
the
God
way of
did.
Jesus.
That's
Yeah.
how God is by
Yeah.
becoming Jesus.
Yeah.
Become sharing in, and therefore for creatures made in that God's image, then that is a pattern and paradigm of what it means to be glorified in God's image. It means to be share in that. So then baptism
Yeah.
vividly enacts that. It
It all
washes
lights
that
up,
we're
right?
it's
Yeah.
all togetherness. He came to us so we could come into him, raise for us, and we're raised with him. It's always together. It's always a tandem. But with this priestly notion, right, we're also consecrated as priests, and blood is applied to priests in their consecration, not from a kippur, not from a decontaminating sacrifice.
Again.
It's from a subset of those well-being sacrifices. Often, if you read in your translations, it'll say it's an ordination sacrifice, but it's also then called a well-being sacrifice because but it's for this purpose of ordination. And then there's oil ritual and some water, and this is what we see depicted in places that talk about our priestly consecration. So I go through some like Revelation. It appears Revelation 7 of us as priests. So Jesus's blood is analogized to the ordination sacrifice, which is not an atonement one, right? And so if we already know what it means for people, so the priests, as I say in the book, they kind of become like living sanctuary furniture, like they're walking sancta. But still, the rule applies. You do not apply atoning kippur blood to a person, even a priest. Even when they say you don't decontaminate them the same way you would the altar and incense, it doesn't happen. Neither their ordination isn't kippur blood, and neither is whenever they do anything wrong, right? It follows the same kind of restrictions. And when kippur blood does get on a priest by accident, as you can imagine, it's going to be, well, that's a problem. It's not like, oh, good, he can use a little too, because he's probably like it becomes you got to mitigate this. And how do you mitigate it? Washing. But like it's a ritual faux pas. So it's like oh, this is undesirable. You cannot have kippur blood on a human being, and if it does get on them,
no, we don't want that.
No, get it off.
So the fact that we've made that to be the heart of the gospel, for instance, to say, oh, the atoning blood should be on us somehow, is again missing entirely.
So when it does talk like in 1 John, it's using it, I think, in a washing analogy. So it's like analogizing Jesus' blood as water and or ordination. Like it is. So we could get the ordination to like we're consecrated as priests, and that's Jesus' life on us, like touching us to consecrate us. But it's not a substitutionary death. This is just bringing you from the realm of you are not fit for sacred space. Now you're consecrated, made like you're ritually pure, and now you're a priest.
Yeah.
So you have access in these stronger ways. But it's not because you don't get to that metaphysical transition on the holiness scale because someone died in your place. Like that's not the logic at all. It's you're being touched with the force of life. And so Jesus, as being the incarnation of God, is just pure life as such, life, what it is, all capitals, life. And he's touching us. It's that contact, the same way Jesus heals through contact, and then sometimes like from afar, right? But it's this idea, Jesus coming into this is why it's place sharing, like him touching into covenant death, the covenant curses. That is what
changes everything,
purifies. The whole and both. And so there is contact with Jesus' blood, but it's in such a different framework and categories, and a lot of people are used to hearing this. But basically, it comes down to God is not wrathing out on Jesus on the cross. That is humanity wrathing out on God and what God endures for the sake of union with creation, to come in contact with death as death, capital D, sin and death, the true pharaohs, the covenant curses, as Moses says, hold before you blessing life, as I mentioned. And by joining his life with ours in the likeness of sinful flesh, becoming sin in that way, in an act of solidarity, then lifting us up, as in Adam all die, so in Christ all are made alive, right? So it's then this coming up out of that through covenant curse, through death. It's that contact Jesus makes with us that then morally purifies us, changes us, transforms us, forms us into a priesthood, forms us into Christ's temple. But Paul doesn't push that temple imagery too far. Even in 1 Corinthians, to kind of circle back to that, like this kind of like, well, if we're the temple or tabernacle or whatever, a priest, then surely we're being we're the objects of atonement. Nope, not for the priests who do. And there's washing rituals in case you do get that sort of blood on you. It's like, that's not supposed to happen. But then he doesn't take it too far, because one of them, I mentioned earlier, like sexual intercourse, right? It makes you, you have to wait at least that evening. You have to wash, and it's got to be sundown, sunrise has to happen. And then you're, if you wanted to, and there was nothing else going on that you did, then you can go sacrifice, have a sacred meal, whatever you're doing. In Corinth, right there in chapter 6 and transitioning to chapter 7, he then deals with, and I think because it logically flows, he's talking about us as a temple and to not then unite with temple prostitutes and stuff. But then you get the question of, well, then from the Corinthians, so even in marriage, we should be abstinent because we are sacred objects, right? So if you're following the temple logic all the way through,
you're so right.
Then you need to abstain from sex. And that's what they're thinking. We're holy. So therefore, the things that generate ritual impurity for sanctuary access, we need to stop because you just said we're temples, right? And that's and so it's an understandable like extrapolation. It's just that Paul says, hold on a minute. Don't take that too far. In fact, he says something totally bizarre for within a Jewish context. Is he says, if you're married to an unbeliever, your children are sanctified through the sexual union that they were born. It's like,
that would
be
unheard
what in
of.
the world? No, exactly, because that's the thing that makes you ritually impure. And we already have like guidance from Paul himself, who taught that we are temples, both how to not take it too far and what this means. Like we're washed, our bodies are washed through water. Like he doesn't apply. You can't just extrapolate from a metaphor and push it to these lengths. One, because it just attend to the priests. They're the ones that turn into living sanctuary stuff. Never do they have kippur blood on them. When they do, no bueno. Don't do that. We gotta get rid of it. And then if we are, well, then how far do we push this? So we have to be abstinent even if in marriage. And Paul's like, no, don't take it that way. Yes, we are a temple, but he's like, basically the only thing I'm trying to tell you is we're suffused by the divine Spirit, right? So for me, it's like if again the irony, like if we're Bible alone, like what's our warrants for extrapolating certain things that are taught, and are there like how do we check ourselves and know when we're going too far or not? Well, here's a good example of like how we get like a case study of what would happen if you push this theology too far. You might say something like we should not be involved with our spouses in sexual intimacy upon becoming members of the body of Christ. And Paul's like, that is not
what I'm talking about here.
Don't go that far.
That's so interesting. So he's really pulling on this imagery and this understanding, this categorical understanding would have resonated with early converts in a way that we don't necessarily have access to, at least not without a lot of work. Where do you think, I didn't put this in our notes, but I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. Where do you think we went so wrong? Historically speaking, like how did we get to this place?
Other people are honestly more fit to answer this. Here's an easy way to critique me. Fill in the gaps of how I'm being overly simplistic here on the historical church history side of things. Anselm himself generates a unique, view of the saving significance of Jesus' death that is known as satisfaction theory. A lot of people don't read the primary sources because so that gets used by Calvin to anchor penal substitution. What is being satisfied? God's sense of retributive justice and that whole bit. That so penal substitution.
That's where it all kind of
but he's like, hey, this is Anselm. And it's like, no, it's not. In fact, it's not even just absent. Again, analogous to the whole Leviticus thing about substitutionary death. Well, Anselm, whatever you want to make of his thing, he, in the beginning, toward the beginning of his book on this, Why God Became Human, I don't know how to pronounce Latin because I never learned it, but cura de homo or something like that. So depending on how you find it online, you can get a version. But very quickly, so book 1, paragraph 8, and following, it's constructed as a dialogue between him and someone else. And he repeatedly, Anselm, rejects the notion presented by his dialogue partner that we would characterize as penal substitutionary atonement. That the Father is condemning Jesus instead of sinners. That is what's going on. He says, no, it's repulsive. Like that's not even fitting for God, and that's not at all what's going on. Jesus was not obedient to the command to die. He died as a result of his continued faithful obedience in these conditions. And he was faithful to the point of death, very like Philippians. I mean, that's the language, that's Philippians 2:8, unto death, faithful and obedient. And so first, what's being satisfied in Anselm's control is God's honor. So it's the honor due. It's a very feudal thing, like, so that you got to honor the,
which makes sense.
We've breached his honor, and Jesus restores the honor by being that faithful human representative. But it's not penal substitution, and you can find it. Like it's book 1,
people who are
section 8. Read that. Even just that, it's also before and after and stuff. But even if you just want to, bite-sized primary source, CCLR, CCEL.org, CCEL.org. You can get access to like so much Christian literature. I mean, the English translation might be a little bit, a little old school feeling, but just look at Anselm, Why God Became Human, and just look at book 1, section 8, read it, and I don't know, pull up Gospel Coalition's definitions of penal substitution, or Stackhouse or whoever, and just be like, all right, look at how Anselm's denying that very thing. And but so Calvin then takes it and says what's being satisfied is that retributive justice. And I don't know, just kind of like it's kind easy once we're so separated from things to misunderstand sacrifice. Right, Israelite sacrifice. We can it because an animal's dying and things, we can. I don't know. It just it's easy to understand how you can quickly be like, well, that thing's dying in our place. This is God's justice. Like it's easy to see that, but it like for scholars, I think it's like, a little bit of investigation should have. You should have been able to realize, hold on, this doesn't actually fit. Like this it's like a very armchair level of awareness.
It gets back to what you're saying in the beginning, where there's not an examination. I think for pastors, or certainly for lay people, you find yourself feeling like you need to defend something. You feel like, I have to defend this thing that doesn't make sense to me, but I'm been told by pastors and others who I respect that this is important, that this is biblical, that this is the way it needs to be. And certainly in Christian families, parents who are catechizing their children into this because they think that is communicating the gospel to them. And so then I think it feels very unmooring for people to say, well, am I losing my faith? Am I deconstructing the heart of the gospel here? Because those are the loudest voices that are saying this is it. And so I think some of that can feel very a mirage, very trippy. But the things continue to be circulated because we don't want to admit error. I'm not sure exactly what it is that we don't want to admit, but as a result, it keeps recycling in so many ways. And this is why I do want to read this excerpt from your book, because I picked it up out of curiosity because the topic interested me, but it was in the middle of researching for the Myth of Good Christian Parenting. And as I was reading through the foreword, this is Douglas Campbell's foreword for your book. On page 19, when I saw this, that's when I started getting out my highlighters. I said, oh, this is going to be relevant to the book I'm working on. He says, in fact, the place where this model, he's talking about penal substitutionary atonement, where this model's assumptions play out most commonly will be in the construction of the family and in parenting. This authoritarian model authorizes the arrangement of families in hierarchical terms and permits parents to enforce its principles. Indeed, more than this, they ought to. Punitive parenting will be the result, sometimes in defense of a hierarchical family order. And those who do not parent punitively and order their families hierarchically are doing their children a disservice as they violate the basic order of the cosmos. Andrew and I, and not a few others, find all this rather horrific and deeply destructive. Something has clearly gone wrong. This is not the gospel's politics, or the correct account of God at all. But what are we to do? The short answer is to follow the argumentative trail through this book, which identifies and knocks out one of this dangerous model's key supporting structures. And I just, amen, all over that, because, none of it's theoretical when you start talking about the way this gets applied, and certainly how it forms people spiritually, just in their understanding of what God is like as an angry, wrathful, punitive deity, kind of waiting for them to screw up, kind of doesn't care who gets punished as long as somebody gets punished. All of this that affects their formation. So for those people, so for people who've been formed by this, what would you invite them to? Your final chapter is titled "When Jesus' Death is Not a Sacrifice," and you kind of open up some of these other metaphors, these other conceptual ways we might consider what's happening here. For people who maybe find themselves in that free fall, where they're saying, I don't know, penal substitutionary atonement, I've been told it's the heartbeat of the gospel. I've tried to make sense of it. It doesn't make sense to me. We've talked a little bit about some alternative ways to think about this. What would you offer to them as an invitation? What is the good news here for people?
I hope I kind of get at that at certain points, in the book or in the conclusion and stuff, because when I talk about why I titled it "Lamb of the Free," not just as a riff on American land of the free, and how again that goes to what are we being rescued from? What Jesus as Passover lamb, it's a conquest of the pharaohs, right? And so we're being invited into that story of God's cosmic exodus, to be made participants in and share in Jesus' life. To be, as Paul says, living narrations of the life and death of Christ for the sake of others, but as anchored in a view of God and the world of unrelenting commitment. I mean, everything that people could put on nice, plaques, Christian plaques, about God's love never fails, and stuff from Romans 8. And yes,
that's it.
That is it. Every mention of the cross, always anchored in God's love. God so loved the world, right? We know love by this. First John, Paul, similarly, God demonstrates his own love. It's love every time. And what is this love? It's unrelenting in the face. Nothing can separate us from it. Not even sin. Not everything Paul lists. And then he's already dealt with how the act of sin that brings the reign of sin and death into the world that we are under, nothing already sealed. Already, this is what Christ did. This is his coming in. It's an incarnational narrative. It really puts pressure on the incarnation. And then, hey, lucky me, I'm not a patristic scholar, but you know what? A lot of the patristic scholars anchor their view of salvation precisely in the incarnation, in the divine life taking on all of sinful flesh. Of Romans 8:3 came in the likeness of sinful flesh. The good news is that God has not abandoned us to death. We are saved from sin and death, not saved from God. God is the deliverer. And yes, there is a sense, as I say, there is a sense in which God's wrath is there, but look at how it's construed. You can, the Ephesians article I mentioned earlier that we can I get more into that and death and so people can see this isn't you do have to take wrath and judgment seriously, but it's what God's life. There's Play-Doh, make spaghetti or
totally.
A cookie cutter Play-Doh, but there's those ones you just crank out something that comes into whatever shape it is. Well, that is God's divine love and judgment. It's anything that does not conform to Christ, the glory of the image of Christ, the cruciform, cross-shaped God, who, being God, all the things in Philippians 2:5-11 that Paul goes on to, or he who was rich became poor. That God, the one who says, "Forgive them, they do not know what they're doing." God is pushing us through that cruciform pattern. And so what God's wrath and judgment is a pruning away of everything that is not cross-shaped. It's pushing us through that. And to the extent that we identify and are those bits that are going to be cut off like that. God has a strong no to that which defiles his creation at all levels. And our rescue is him saving us from manifesting and being false versions of ourselves. So we are made to conform to the glory and image of Christ, who is God. We are made in the image of God. The good news is that God has not abandoned us, because he has not abandoned Christ, who became fully what we are, to seed humanity with his divine life, to cleanse and purify and transform us, and to raise us up together with him. The good news is that there's nothing there. There is nothing that can separate us from that divine love and promise to see his creation become the glorified, mature object of his desire and love that's not just human. So this is why Paul says all creation, the good news is being proclaimed to all creation. All things in heaven and on earth are being reconciled to God, to the cross. This is a story of God's faithful commitment to us. The cross is not the precondition of God's love. It is what God endured as he was forgiving and loving us. It is Jesus's own drawing into God, taking into God's self through the incarnation, all the sufferings and heartache, joining with each one of us, both as victims and victimizers, and bringing the divine life to touch down as far as sin drags us into death. And he goes all the way there to take us all the way out in exaltation. That is Romans 8, Romans 5-8, I guess, and more is that, but nothing can separate us. We can live in that freedom. We can live in that newness, be set free join in this cosmic exodus. God is leading us through Christ, redeeming us from death, from covenant death that is already patterned after Genesis 3, but it's the futile ways of life of your ancestors, as Peter says, or in Titus. Paul also claimed, it's these acts of ungodliness and greed and all this, that we've been made. The gift of God has come to make us and the people capable of good works, of good deeds, not as a matter of earning. He's already done it. He's already did all this stuff, right? It's not earning, it's being who we are. We are made to be image bearing human beings. And that is the only way to happiness, in the sense of not just like, kind of like the philosophical happiness, eudaimonia, like this contentment of being the creatures we are made to be in relation to all other creatures. And so the good news is that just as Christ brings his healing touch, to the paralytic, to the woman with a unnatural flow for years, he brings the divine touch all the way down to the deepest parts that sin has touched. And there is nothing, therefore, that can separate us from God's loving Christ. And
That'll preach every time. That's beautiful.
So for parenting, it's like, do you look at your child as someone that God loves? That God, do you see yourself as a nurturer, cultivating a life at various stages? We're never complete. That's the other myth, right? Like, oh, I'm an adult, so I'm mature. Like, well, I hope I don't stop maturing into the likeness of Christ, right? And that's what we're doing. We're cultivating
this participation.
And to parent from a Christ likeness, well, then you got to be parenting with God's yes and affirmation first.
Yeah.
That has to be primary. That has to come through. That doesn't mean you don't say no to destructive behaviors, but how do we address those in a manner that's like Christ? Well, it's got to be then in cross-shaped service of being the one to step up, of then, okay, if we want to even tweak a little bit of this, like the costs of forgiveness or whatever, well, then that means we got to shoulder some of their mistakes, right? We're join in them in the costs and in their consequences. So anecdotally, I do know a couple of people who are driven to, let's say, abortion, because the sin of sexual immorality was going to be met with such harshness that better to pretend like it never happened, right, than for the parents or for the community. Again, there's some complications, anecdotal and stuff, but take in this surprise new life. How do we, that would be shouldering the consequences. Now you're kicked out. and you go live, and
You
then you're
need a
creating more
punishment.
abusive
Yeah.
problem, whatever's going on. And I guess you're an
Mhm.
adult, so you pay. No, take that in, share it, share the burdens. And I mean, you're gonna say easy for you to say, how old are your kids, Andrew? I also work with students and stuff, and I've worked with children a bit. Like, I know there's no like formula, but from the gospel, we are trained and hopefully habituated into a story of sharing in one another's burdens to maintain that unconditional relationship that is the only way. Love covers a multitude of sins, from Peter. And so we are sharing in Christ's body as we activate that in our lives. And that's sometimes going to mean either whether it comes from the angle of join with those who are being oppressed and stand up as an ally and therefore make yourself a target along with them because you're joining with it. So it could be that sort of kind of cross-like suffering because you're leaving these places of security. Again, I'm talking more people that have, social privilege in one way or
Yeah.
another. Or as parents and stuff or friends, like when people make these mistakes that have consequences, the Christ-like thing to do is to unite with those, to bear them with them for the sake of healing, reconciliation, and renewal. Like that's the story that's consistent with. So as we take in the Lord's Supper, and as Paul says, we're sharing in the body, sharing in the blood of Christ. We are remembering that we are to be that cross-shaped, living out the death of Christ so that life may be made known in others. So I think it absolutely impacts the way we parent, our
Oh,
relationships, everything, the way we
yes.
handle people's mistakes. But societies that have been based on these notions of penal substitution, I highlight this in the intro and it just gets people upset. It's like, well, now it's more, oh, you're just, you're trying to say this is the cause of racism and our problems of criminal justice. I don't know if it's the cause, but it sure does support and nurture
Yeah.
problematic
Yeah.
ways of
None of
dealing
it's
with
theoretical.
human.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it sure does. And that's traceable. So Hannah Bowen's article, just for starters and stuff. But yeah, these things, I don't know. I don't want to put it in an easy cause and effect relationship, but most people want to live an integrated life. And a lot of people will come to realize this is really incongruent. My theology is incongruent with how I want to parent, and or my, like the other way around. I'm learning
Mhm.
this stuff about penal substitution. How can I rethink how I'm living this out? And so we want to constantly reevaluate um, what we're doing. Does our practice and praxis match with our confessions? And so it's not an easy, like, well, you just fix this theology,
Mhm.
the prison system gets fixed and parenting gets fixed. The things are well-worn paths and habits and norms, and it takes an intense intentionality and
Mhm.
purposefulness to keep this story before us so that we know what we need to calibrate ourselves to. So, and that we're able, that we are been suffused by the divine life precisely to calibrate ourselves
Mm.
to this. Um, and that is our witness.
Mhm.
That is our witness, the transformed life, the transformed community, raising human beings who are conformed to the glory of Christ with one like another and our children, the next generation.
Mm.
That is the witness. If our theology is producing people championing internment camps and selective application of retributive justice to people who may or may not be undocumented, well, what about the people who are hiring them? Why are they being thrown in these same vans? All these employers who are unlawfully doing these things, right? So there's even the retributive justice isn't even applied
Yeah.
consistently, right?
Yeah.
So how do we as Christians witness against that? Well, we got to embody a whole new mode of relationships in life, starting with the family and up and with churches and denominational leadership and all that, but to embody the peaceableness of God's kingdom, the forgiveness
Mm.
of God's kingdom, this release from these systems of oppression, which the Bible names as death. That is the curse
Yeah.
of death. Like
These are not
it's
the
being
way of
wrapped up
both.
in that.
Yeah.
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 So I kind of got
Oh,
lost there in my own
no,
thoughts,
I'm
but
so glad you did. This is what a powerful way to end, noting the relevance to, yeah, our individual lives, our family lives, our communities, how we, show forth God's image in the world, and, oh, so much to chew on. I will link to your book, Where else can people find you? I know you're on Twitter, but is that kind of where you engage publicly?
Yeah, I haven't started a blog yet
Okay.
or whatever. I'm on Blue Sky as well. I think I have Threads, but that's also less. I don't know. It just so happens, apparently, I've just kind of stuck around on, and I still call it Twitter.
Okay, so speaking of Twitter, you went a little viral last week. It really blew up in the past couple of weeks, and seems like everywhere, wherever I logged on, people were talking about penal substitutionary atonement in your book in different ways. So can you tell a little bit about how that came to be, or what kind of conversations you were seeing, or what that's been like for you?
Sure, yeah. I woke up, I forget whatever day it was, and it lasted. I thought it was going to blow over quicker than it did. Now I think they've moved on the Cracker Barrel.
Yeah, I know, right?
In real time. I don't know when this is going to come on, but whenever Cracker Barrel is all the rage, that's when we're recording this.
That's where we're at.
Okay, yeah. So John Mark Comer posted on his Instagram stories a shot of my book, and said it was a very tamed comment. It was high praise, but then he said I'm gonna read criticisms or rebuttals or something like that next, and just kind of highly recommend it. Well, that then people in the Gospel Coalition Network and beyond even took that, and no one was engaged. Well, I don't know, because they probably didn't hear of me before, so I don't know if they had time, I'm no one. So they're like, well, John Mark Comer doesn't likes this book, which means we don't like it.
So it maybe was caught up in his
here's
persona.
a reassertion. Yeah, here's a reassertion of penal substitutionary atonement. He says that this thing might be the final knockout blow. Again, and then he said, but I'm going to read rebuttal. So he didn't even it was a very cautious thing. And then he since kind of walks himself back from other people of oh, well, wait, I'm there's some things I have problems with, but he didn't really say what they are, other than what I do discuss in the book, and the notion of substitution. So John Mark Comer was like, well, this aspect of Rillera's book, he wasn't apparently he's just uncomfortable with, or wasn't quite sold on, or I don't know. So a lot of the responses were more just reassertions of penal substitutionary atonement, either proof texting or just quick, here's why penal substitutionary atonement's fine, and the critiques fall short. But it's well, you didn't read my critiques, because I'm not going those usual routes. So it's really easy to tell if someone read even a little bit of what I was doing, because I don't make, although I do have moral problems with many iterations of penal substitutionary atonement, and theological problems in terms of what that means about the Trinity. I didn't go that route because that's not my area of expertise. If that makes sense. So people usually respond to those kinds of things, and they think that my book is in that same vein, but it's not. Yeah. It's more of a secondary, as I say in the introduction, it's a secondary result of what I was doing more positively. What are these? I'm actually ironically following a lot of their stated hermeneutics in these places where grammatical, historical reading. Okay, well, let's situate this in its historical context. Let's actually read it in context. Let's understand the languages, Hebrew and Greek, and how these words mean. What is their, not just looking at a lexicon. Oh, it can mean this range of meaning. Let's pick one that there's more linguistic restrictions on how these things come together. Looking at how the New Testament makes use of it's a complicated system, the Levitical system. There's lots of nuances, and a lot of theological frameworks just flatten that all out. And then it just becomes about death or blood. So anything about Jesus' death is always sacrificial, and all sacrifices are basically one thing. They're all atoning, whatever that means. And this is the only means of forgiveness. And the animal died clearly, so therefore it was your death. It's just a lot of quick associations that are very hasty, and easily demonstratable to be hasty. Read what my research is, and a lot of what I'm actually doing, a lot of what's new is more connecting the dots. A lot of what I do is working on or giving further support, strengthening arguments that were already made before. They're just not as well known, even by New Testament scholars, to make these connections between how they're talking about Jesus' death, sometimes in sacrificial language, sometimes not. So when people are like responding to the book that aren't engaging any of my particularities, I'm like, well, you like, then it kind of markets itself at that point. It's like, well, I feel like still haven't
give it a read.
Can't just reassert the thing. You gotta see what I've been saying. Yeah, you can't.
Because it can kind of come across as like a knee-jerk reaction of like, oh no, penal substitutionary atonement is in peril. Like we need to defend this.
Yeah. The criticisms are categorical often, or that I found online. It was more like, this is against PSA, therefore it's wrong. Here's nothing in my particular. That said, there were a couple, and I responded. So if you want to know, like, I don't have a blog. Maybe I should get one. I don't know.
Yeah.
But Peter Leithart wrote a review.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess since I said it on Twitter, I might as well, like, it's just, this isn't the way you review academic books. You don't put them behind a paywall with Substack and not go through the peer review. Like, there are reviews of my book from other scholars in academic journals. You can read, that'll give you a good summary, because you actually know what I want to say. And so he reposted it when Leithart did, when all this was going on. I guess he did it months ago, but it was under the paywall. And I was like, either publish this in a journal or take it beyond a paywall. Like, what are you doing
we
here?
We need to be able to read it. Yeah, at least.
And he didn't attack the other thing. This is just a cultural issue. So since I know a lot of your channel, it's like the practice of evangelical, even with respect to parenting and the theology that undergirds that. And I question whether a lot of the people who even absorbed a lot of the parenting stuff that you're doing, these parenting books, actually even read a lot of what they're doing, because they don't. This is like there's like a lack of reading. So here's an example with Peter Leithart stuff. So he has some criticisms, and I address them on my Twitter profile. If you want to go look at that. Other people, even the reading of the critique, even the ear tickling reading that's going to affirm their things. There's so many people who clearly didn't even read it. Not my book, but even Leithart seemed to because if they did, they would understand it can't function rhetorically how you're trying to make it function on Twitter as a this saves penal substitutionary atonement. It doesn't. It has. And you would know that if you read his thing.
Yeah.
I like it. There's just all these instances. And so that's what's more struck me. It's just more like, man, I don't know how to really engage that sector, because there's such a lack of curiosity that seems embedded in the social framework and their norms and of how they go about sharing information, and this guardian and protectionism, that it's like, I know there's curious people because I was in it. So that's the other thing. It's like, I do a little bit because I know that there's going to be people who are like me, who are like my mom, who are like some people I was at school with, fellow students, or now the ones I teach, where they are curious and they're going to poke through and see, they're able to discern, oh, wait a minute, this is like, you're skirting the issue or whatever. And so for that, I thank them, because it's reaching, those people probably would have never heard of me, because again, I'm no one. I'm not, and they're like ironically making me known by the people who will be inquisitive, and hopefully then I can help them, see our scriptures together in greater clarity. And so I'm thankful in that sense for it. I never expected that to ever happen. Just like, and it's not, I'm thankful I'm not the John Mark Comers of the world and all that, because and I don't want to.
Oh, that's a lot to be in the spotlight.
Thanks.
Yeah. I did find it interesting that after a while, a few people were trying to walk it back, because I think there was that realization of like, oh, this is getting a lot of word out about this book, and others will pick it up. And I think that's great, because I think even that response note really shows how it strikes a nerve for people. And so I really hope for people, if they're feeling that, or if they've been interested in the things we've said here, you will look for Andrew's book, Lamb of the Free, Recovering the Varied Sacrificial Understandings of Jesus' Death. Again, look for the link to this and other things we mentioned in our conversation in the show notes. Thank you so much for sharing your thought. We could talk. There's so many things, like so many other questions I could lay before you, but thank you so much for giving us so much of your time, for sharing some of your work with us. I hope many people will continue to read it. I'm always holding out hope that there will be
Thank you.
some
Yeah, no,
version
you
of
know
this
what?
for the lay people. I'd love that.
You're doing me a favor. Like I've done a few now more podcasts since, and I'm more comfortable, just being recorded. So thank you, because if I wouldn't be doing any of this unless folks like you are asking me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us today in the church library for this special bonus episode. Again, we were speaking with Andrew Remington Rillera, author of Lamb of the Free, Recovering the Varied Sacrificial Understandings of Jesus' Death. What a wonderful conversation, and what a way to bridge over from season 1 to season 2. So thanks for joining us in the church library. We hope that you will stay tuned for book launch and book release information, and we will keep you posted on all of that, as well as when season 2 of In the Church Library will return. If you haven't already, you can subscribe for our monthly email newsletter. You can sign up at marissaburt.com. There's a link at the bottom of the page, and if you do that, you'll get a little downloadable freebie we've created that's kind of a metric to help you evaluate the health of various Christian parenting resources. So check that out if you like, and we look forward to catching you next season here in the Church Library. We are so glad you've joined us in the Church Library today. This is Marissa Franks-Burt
and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And if you liked what you heard here, we think you'll be interested in reading our forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families.
You can pre-order it now wherever books are sold, and it'll be on shelves in October of 2025.